As we know, the American Revolution began after a series of instigations and revoked rights of the British colonists by the Crown and Parliament. Remember to keep in mind, on the eve of the Revolution, the Continental Congress attempted to avoid the bloody war by sending the Olive Branch Petition. The gesture fell short, and the colonists found themselves up against the largest and most experienced army and navy the world had ever seen, at least in the modern world. Many challenges were presented to the colonists, as you have noted in your research assignments and what we have discovered in class. But keep in mind, the distribution of colonists and their ideals and values was broken down into a third, a third, a third. A third of the colonists were patriots, a third identified as loyalists, and a third were not interested or affected either way. A minority will be leading the charge in the revolution. The loyalists were spread out throughout the colonists, but had more of a stronghold in the South and port cities. Most loyalists believed what the Patriots were doing was an act of treason. Because the Navigation Acts created a system of trade almost exclusively through the United Kingdom, the colonists were at a loss when it came to trading. As trading decreased, money in circulation decreased, and funding for the war effort became an issue for the colonists. Not to mention, many manufactured goods, such as guns and ammunition, came from the one source where trade no longer existed, which was, of course, Britain. Military strategies differed among the two forces. The Americans saw this as a war of attrition. The goal in a war of attrition is to wear down the enemy until he surrenders. The British had long supply lines, meaning supplies would have to be sent across the Atlantic, taking time. Using guerrilla tactics, the colonists could fight an insurgent war. They did not have to destroy the British, they simply had to prolong the rebellion until the supply lines ran out and the British taxpayers lost patience. The colonists also needed a partner in crime. This was, of course, the French. Making an alliance with one of Britain's enemies, an enemy that had unlimited resources, would undercut the strength of the British. The British took a different approach. Their goal was to concentrate on the northern campaign and then focus on the south. They would blockade ports to prevent the flow of supplies, and they would use the loyalists to satisfy a divide and conquer strategy. The issue the British experienced was taming the countryside and having enough men to hold a city once it was taken. This became impossible and led to a military that was spread much too thin. In June of 1775, on Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill, the colonists and the British met during the siege of Boston. On June 13, 1775, the leaders of the colonial forces taking Boston learned that the British were planning to send troops out from the city to fortify the unoccupied hills surrounding the city, which would give them control of Boston Harbor. In response, 1,200 colonial troops under the command of William Prescott occupied Bunker Hill and Breed's Hill. During the night, the colonists constructed a barrier on Breed's Hill, as well as smaller fortified lines across the Charleston Peninsula. By the end of the battle, the British were shocked to find that more than 40% of their men were part of the casualties. The vantage point was given to the colonists, aiding in cutting off British supply lines. The Northern campaign was led by William Howe and Richard Howe on the British side, and George Washington leading for the colonists. Howe's men were career military personnel. They were large in number and carried with them the latest technology. Washington was given 18,000 poorly trained, poorly supplied men to defend New York. In less than 6 months, 25% of Washington's men were killed or captured. With the British in striking distance of Philadelphia, Washington decided to seize the offensive before the morale of his army and country collapsed completely. On Christmas night, 1776, he led his troops back into New Jersey and attacked a Hessian garrison at Trenton, where he captured 918 Germans and lost only 4 of his troops. Washington then attacked 1,200 British at Princeton on January 3rd, 1777, and killed or captured 1/3 of them while sustaining only 40 casualties of his own. What's more important here are the consequences. The consequences of these victories are great. First, it boosted morale. Secondly, it drove a wedge between 5,000 loyalists and the British Army, and New Jersey's loyalism never recovered from the blow it received when it evacuated the state. Many of Britain's loyalists flipped to the Patriot cause soon after. New York's harbor served as an important port to the British. At the time, New York City was far from a metropolis. In 1776, a fire broke out. Washington denied any involvement. However, he was accused of starting the fire. But the British punished those colonists living there. Patriot homes were given to British officers. Churches were turned into prisons and barracks. Loyalist refugees flooded the city, leading to overcrowding. The British declared martial law in the city, and the city laid waste to crime and poor sanitation. At the same time, phase 2 is going to continue. Burgoyne, who was a British general coming from the far north, was to meet St. Leger, arriving from the west at Albany. St. Leger was stopped at Fort Stanwix, approximately about 100 miles from Albany, and he was forced to retreat. He never sends word to Burgoyne that he retreated. Burgoyne continues on and takes Fort Ticonderoga and moves toward Albany. Colonial General Gates attacks Burgoyne as his forces are entering Saratoga. Gates won 2 battles and Burgoyne surrendered. This event and win becomes the turning point in the war. St. Leger and Burgoyne's failure to secure the northern campaigns were a result of poor planning and communication. The British are going to fall victim to pride throughout the entire war. While the campaign was underway, Ben Franklin was sent to France to negotiate for aid with the king. Working with the Marquis de Lafayette, Washington in the colonies and Franklin at court in France attempted to prove to Louis XVI that they were worthy of an alliance. Louis XVI said the colonists had to win a strategic battle. Saratoga was that battle. France joined the colonists, and Spain and the Dutch Republic enter on the side of the French. Washington realized his men were ill-trained and enlisted the aid of Prussian military inspector general Baron von Steuben. Von Steuben arrived at Valley Forge and for 4 months drilled the soldiers, creating a formidable opponent for British General Clinton later in the war. Britain leaves the South as the last campaign in the war. Britain thought that there were more loyalists in the South, and the thought was invasion would spark support. The British did not take into account the promise made to slaves by the British Crown. Parliament made a decree that any slave willing to fight for the British military would be freed after the war. While slavery still existed in all the colonies at the time, none seemed to be more important than those in the South. The promise cost the British many loyalists. The British also struggled to pacify the countryside. Brutal guerrilla tactics surprised and hurt the British time and time again. General Greene, for the colonists, executed a strategy to stretch supply lines and wear down the British in the form of casualties. Although Greene did not win one single battle, he essentially played a crucial role aiding the colonists in winning the war. As Clinton was to focus on the North, Cornwallis led the forces in the South. Cornwallis's plan was to fan out his regiments into Virginia and Pennsylvania. Cornwallis was extremely disappointed in the progress made throughout the South thus far. He was appalled by the lack of gentlemanly and professional behavior among the colonial militias. The use of guerrilla warfare and blatant disregard of established rules of engagement angered and deterred Cornwallis from advancing as planned. As Cornwallis was reaching Yorktown, Clinton was supposed to be joining his forces from the north. On August 30th, 1781, the French fleet landed at Yorktown, immediately dispersing troops in an attempt to aid the colonial army. As Cornwallis was fighting the southern regiments, guerrilla militias, and the fresh French troops, Washington quickly moved his troops in front of Clinton, stopping the northern battalions from reaching and helping Cornwallis. After 3 weeks of fighting, Cornwallis, actually his first in command, surrendered on October 19, 1781. While the Treaty of Paris ended the war between the colonies and the British Empire, the treaty left many questions up in the air. Florida's borders were never defined. Loyalists lost their land and in some cases were chased to Canada. Pre-war debts still had to be paid. Slaves taken by the British were never returned. Native Americans were given no land or status, and the colonists were not sure what type of society or government they would assume. The next several years would be a true test of the former colonists and their leaders. Okay, so lastly, you have 2 questions to answer. The first, using what you know, explain the causes for the win by the colonists. And secondly, create a list of concerns the colonists may have entering into a democracy.